Greetings. With this Photoshop, we just want to look at some basic image editing tools, what we refer to as global editing, where we're not making minute selections, we're just looking at the whole image. I have a photograph here I took from the car of Ute Mountain down in the Four Corners area. This would be southwestern Colorado. So I'll click on Photoshop here, and most of our basic image manipulations happen under image adjustments, and we can see here vibrance, hue, saturation, color, black and white. We can also see that they're kind of blanked out. That's because I'm working on a file that I've worked on before and I'm not on the background layer. And that's one of the basic things that you can, when you run into Photoshop, problems in Photoshop and you can't do things, always check to make sure you're on the layer. Alright, so anyways, I'll click on the background layer, and now when I go to image adjustments, all that stuff is accessible. When they're grayed out like they were, you can't actually utilize them, so you have to figure out why. Okay, so I can do hue, saturation, vibrance. This image doesn't need really too much manipulation, but just about every photograph can benefit from some minor things. And I usually look at curves. Up here is curves, levels, exposures. These are brightness, contrast. These are value, density, contrast sort of things. Down here is your color sort of issues. And then down here we can invert, posterize, do more fancy things. There's also some HDR toning and things, and overall desaturate. Most of the stuff we want here, these first two sort of sections. Alright, so one other thing here is I often don't use the adjustments under image. I usually go to layer and do a new adjustment layer. And you'll see most of the things here that you saw in image adjustments. The difference is it creates a layer instead of affecting the image directly. It just puts a layer, like a filter, over things. And the nice thing about that is you can turn it on or off very easily and quickly. So if you don't like it, you can turn it off and do it again. Whereas if you do it in image adjustments, you have to undo it and go back in your history or whatever it is. This is a way that you can deal with it anytime you want to change your image. So I would go to image, curves is where I usually start. Levels is easier. We see our histogram here, and one of the things we want to look for is clipping. We don't have any clipping because clipping, these are my shadow areas, dark values, midtones, and then these are the highlights and the light values. You can see that it ends before it gets to the white, and this stops before it gets to the edge. So I probably want to move this in a little bit closer. That tends to add a little bit of saturation, also adding density. And do this, and then we see when our curve, this line gets higher angle, that's more contrast. So, and sometimes that's good, and sometimes it's bad. So if I drag this down, it probably gets a little too dark. I like the sky better here, but you see the foreground just gets too dark. And this is where you'd probably consider, going beyond global manipulation and get to refer to local manipulation, where you're actually selecting the different areas. But I just want to stick to global here. So I might drag it down a little bit. I usually find just a little S-curve in a lot of images adds a nice contrast if you're not wanting to go too much farther. We can play, we can add as many points on this as we want. I might bring this up a little bit. That seems a little bit better. This curve is pretty dynamic, and if you understand the curves layer, you can do just about, well, not everything, but a lot of things with this without going to other places. Alright, so there I made a curves adjustment, and we can turn it on and off, and you can see if you like it, and I think it looks better with that curves adjustment layer. You can try other things. We can do levels. Levels also works, can be a good way. Here again you see your histogram, so we can move the shadows up, kind of similarly to what we did in curves, and we can move the highlights here. Then the other thing is your midpoint. Where do you want your midpoint? So if I drag it here, it makes all these values lighter than middle gray, and if I drag it the other way, it takes the values and say all these values are darker than middle gray. So that's how this works, and so here we're lighter. and then here we're darker, and it always starts at 1.00, so you can find that point. So I might maybe just drag it just this way just a little bit. So you can see we do something somewhat similar in levels as we did in curves, though I think curves you get a little bit more fine-tune and control. You can see there's some difference between those. Actually, not too much. All right. So the other thing we can do is brightness and contrast. These are just what I refer to as sort of brute force sliders. There's not a lot of nuance to them. You know, I want it brighter, darker. I want it contrastier or less contrasty. You know, there's just not a lot of nuance. Sometimes they can work for quick adjustments, but I almost never use those tools. Let's see, new adjustment layer, let's see. So exposure kind of is similar to like your camera, and you can adjust it. If something's obviously under or overexposed, this might be a good place to start. You know, and so you can add plus, and you see +1, and this is in stops of light. So it's just like going from f11 to f8 in your aperture. So that would be overexposed the whole stop. Or you can underexpose it from what you did. So sometimes that can be useful and simple for us as photographers to figure out. I don't often use this either, but I occasionally do. Usually I'll use it in Camera Raw more than I'll use it directly in Photoshop. And then I don't actually ever play with offset, so I don't really know too much about what it does, but I'm just playing here and seeing. Gamma correction. Make some nice, more subtle adjustments here. You can see this, when we go this way, it seems to affect the midtones to dark. When we go this way, it seems to affect the lighter values, obviously making it lighter. Assuming 1.0 is what zeroed out. I actually like that a little bit this way. Okay. And of course, then I can turn on and off these adjustments. So, all right, so those are some basic adjustments for your values, your density, and your contrast in the image. And then, of course, you always want to file and save your things. Always file, save as, always save your file as something else, not over the original file, which is pretty good because when you bring it into Photoshop, it makes it a PSD is the default and not a JPEG, so you don't often save over your JPEGs. All right, there is that information.